During World War I, women were impacted in a way that life and their role in society would change. During the war, the condition in which women lived was horrible, as they had no choice but to become accustomed to the lifestyle and superiority of men. Since the men had left to join the war, the women who didn't serve as nurses had to get jobs. The long-term effect of the war was beneficial to women, as they earned themselves a higher status within society. Propaganda posters were used as a method for people to support the cause of World War I. There were many areas that were supported, from women's involvement for the battlefield to replacing men in the factory setting. The propaganda posters were used especially to lure women into the factories and get the remaining working men to join the war, since there was enough manpower to sustain the factory lines. These posters were also used as a funding method for the armies of the various countries, which were later found out to be simply schemes to earn money. As the main historian of women's work, Gail Braben claims that for many women, the war was a genuinely liberating experience that made them feel useful as citizens, but that also gave them the freedom and the wages only men had enjoyed so far. Approximately 1.6 million women joined the workforce between 1914 and 1918 in government departments, public transport, the post office as clerks in business, as land workers, and in factories. Women in these overcrowded factories produced 80% of the supplies and weapons used in the war and risked their lives daily by being exposed to the harmful chemicals as they executed the high demand of military defense materials. After the war, the women who worked these factories, later referred to as canaries, received recognition for their sacrifice to the war and country, but not enough considering the long and unconditional work environment. Rather than making a compromise to keep a percentage of the working women employed, they were simply dismissed so that the men could resume to a normal lifestyle.
According to the United States Army, the Army Nurse Corps had approximately 403 nurses who were active at the onset of the war, as well as roughly 170 reserve nurses who treated numerous types of wounds, including infections and mustard gas burns. By November 11, 1918, there were about 21,480 enlisted nurses serving, with more than 10,000 of them stationed and serving overseas. Much of the care for American servicemen came from the Red Cross, which served as a nursing reserve to the Navy and Army. However, by the end of the war, nearly 300 Red Cross nurses had also lost their lives, as well as over 200 Army nurses and 36 Navy nurses. During World War I, nurses were faced with soldiers suffering from emotional injuries, including shell shock. They treated patients near or just behind the front lines at field hospitals, or at evacuation stations or clearinghouses, and could be found at base stations, which were generally far removed from battle. However, they also served in troop transports and transport ships. Some nurses even drove ambulances.
Working conditions for nurses overseas were generally poor. They worked from sunup to sundown and barely got any sleep. An anonymous nurse also wrote about the food in a passage of her diary.
Food was getting beautifully less and less, and we lived for the most part on beans and potatoes and soup made of the same, flavored with many fryings and in the frying pan.
They also had to see and treat severe and often horrifying injuries with minimal equipment. Unfortunately, nurses serving the Army were not afforded the status of officers, yet were awarded many service medals. They also had to see and treat severe and often horrifying injuries with minimal equipment. Nurses serving the Army were not given respect equal to officers, but were awarded many service medals. 24 nurses were awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, 28 received the French Croix de Guerre, and the British Royal Red Cross was awarded to 69. The Army's second highest award, the Distinguished Service Cross, was also awarded to 2 nurses, and the Navy awarded Navy Crosses to 4 of its nurses. Famous nurses include Edith Cavell, Flora Sanders, and Helen Gwenvan.
In addition to working as nurses and laborers, women also worked as entertainers in the war. They danced, sang, and read to entertain the troops when they weren't out fighting. Women also worked as telephone operators and journalists. In conclusion, playing a part in World War I enabled women to enjoy a slight uplift in status in society thereafter. They gained the supporters and momentum necessary to earn their right to vote. They showed society they were able to do men's jobs and were intellectually more than capable.